Are we ready?
The broadcast of the regular meeting of the Budget Committee will now begin.
Good morning. My name is Lene Palmisano. I'm the chair of the Budget Committee. I'll call to order this regular meeting for Friday, July 10th. Before we proceed, I'll note for the record that this meeting has remote participation by council members and city staff pursuant to Minnesota Open Meeting Law, Section 13D.021, due to the declared state of local public health emergency. At this time, I'll ask the clerk to call the roll to verify the presence of a quorum of council members. Mr. Clerk.
Councilmember Reich.
Present.
Gordon.
Here.
Cunningham.
Present.
Ellison.
Present.
Goodman.
Present.
Jenkins.
Here.
Kano. Bender.
Here.
Schrader.
Here.
Johnson.
Present.
Vice Chair Fletcher.
Here.
Councilmember Kano. Chair Palmisano.
Present.
There are 11 members present.
Thank you. Colleagues, we have one item today, and that is an analysis from our budget director on the mayor's proposed 2020 budget revisions, which we received yesterday. As I noted then, this revised budget is in response to the financial challenges that face our city in the face of multiple emergencies. Today's presentation is intended to provide us with a fuller understanding of where those targeted reductions are planned and what impact we anticipate those reductions will have, both in the short term as we complete the current year, but also for longer term projections as we anticipate the 2021 fiscal budget and beyond. Before I recognize Mr. Intermill for the staff presentation, I'm going to just review my plan for conducting this meeting. First, I'll recognize the budget director for his presentation. If there are any specific issues or questions, council members, please signal me using the chat feature. I will note we're joined by almost all of our department heads for this meeting, so they are all on standby here to respond to questions or issues that might be raised. Once we've completed the presentation, I'll open the floor to further questions or concerns from council members. Once we've concluded all questions today, we can review the remaining timeline for this budget process. Mr. Intermill also has it in his presentation, and then close today's meeting. Are there any initial questions before we start from my colleagues? Seeing none, I'll welcome, President Bender, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. To clarify, did you suggest asking questions throughout the presentation as well, or holding them till the end?
Both. So if there's something specific to a slide that Mr. Intermill is on, if you signal in the chat feature, I will pause the budget director at the end of, if they're shortly thereafter to call on someone. But then afterwards as well, we'll invite additional questions or broader kinds of questions. Thank you for the clarification. Seeing no one else, with that, I'll welcome Director Intermill and ask him to present the staff analysis of the proposed revisions to our 2020 budget. Mr. Intermill, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you, Chair Palmisano, Council President Bender, Vice President Jenkins, and members of the committee. As you know, I'm Micah Intermill, the city's budget director, and it's my pleasure to join you today. Can we have the next slide, please? I want to start by reminding the committee of where we are, how we got here, and where we're going. Our approach to responding to the financial challenges presented by the sudden onset of the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic recession we now find ourselves in has been intentionally methodical and measured. In March, we took stock of our position. We surveyed a new and unfamiliar terrain in which general mobility plummeted 70% in the metro area, severely slowing the economic faucet that fills a great many revenue pools. With clear eyes, we recognized the city to be existing in a new revenue reality under which we would need to reduce our budget by $156 million, or about 10%. Policymakers took quick action, implementing a series of cost containment measures to help stave off deep austerity later this year. The mayor and council leadership decided to implement administrative cuts first and tack more deliberatively, while still quickly, on the more complex policy choices involved in solving the total problem. Last month, this council acted to implement the first phase of budget reductions, and just yesterday, the mayor delivered remarks on his recommended approach to phase 2 of our budget revision. Today, I'll be walking you through the details of that approach, and I intend to highlight the various policy considerations inherent in each of 4 primary cost containment strategies included in this proposal. As I mentioned last month, staff will continue to monitor actual revenues as those data become available, and will also keep an eye towards leading economic indicators. I'm confident in the strength behind the assumptions we've used to estimate the impacts to revenues and the savings generated through each cost containment strategy, but I won't be shy about coming back and letting you know if we need to adjust course. Next slide, please. You're familiar with this slide, but it's worth repeating for you and the public the scope of our total problem in 2020 as an anticipated revenue shortfall of $156 million as compared to our 2020 adopted budget. The bulk of that shortfall comes in the city's general and downtown assets funds, with the largest decline hitting our local option sales taxes, where we had budgeted $93 million of local tax revenues for the year. We now only expect to collect $38 million. Those taxes are collected in the downtown assets funds, and over $32 million were budgeted for transfer to the general fund. Because of the severity of the decline in that revenue source, we must reduce our transfer from the downtown assets fund to the general fund by $22 million. And last month's phase 1 actions netted $58 million in cost containments. So the remaining shortfall to be solved through the conversation of the next few weeks is roughly $98 million. Next slide, please. The first strategy included in this proposal is to convert $12.3 million of planned capital expenditures in the 2020 budget to be debt supported rather than cash supported. That is, we would issue additional debt rather than using cash for specific capital projects in the general fund and the parking fund. The general fund projects are primarily related to the 20-year Parks and Streets plan, as well as a comparatively small investment in planning and pre-design work associated with the new first precinct. In the parking fund, the projects are the new impound lot and replacement of parking meter pay stations. This is one of the few approaches through phase 1 or phase 2 that we can take to solve for a portion of our shortfall that will not impact the delivery of our planned programming. This is about how we pay for the work. It's not about foregoing the work. However, it's not without trade-off. The policy considerations associated with this strategy include questions such as, are we okay with taking on additional costs in order to execute the same service level, as borrowing brings with it interest payments down the road, as well as the transactional costs of debt issuance? And of course, we cannot borrow today without expecting to repay that debt tomorrow. So it's important to recognize that in taking on these debts, we're limiting the amount of work that can be bought with tomorrow's dollars, as some portion will need to be used to pay for today's expenses. I'll pause here and answer any questions you may have, or we can move to the next slide.
Yeah, thank you. Councilmember Gordon and then Cunningham.
Thank you very much. And I'm just curious about the Parks and Streets capital project plan. Are we deferring the timeline on any of those projects? And if so, how much and what ones are we deciding that we need to keep on track, or will we be spending the 12.3 on a little bit? Just some more details around that, because it seems like one of our choices would be just to defer those improvements for future years.
Thank you, Chair Palmisano and Councilmember Gordon. We are not deferring any of the planned capital expenditure related to Parks and Streets this year. When at the time that the pandemic and financial situation changed, we had already engaged in contracts and started down the road of that work. And so this does not impact the timing of any of this year's planned projects associated with Parks and Streets. It is a policy question on the table for the 2021 budget, though, for you all and the mayor, as well as the park board to consider.
Thank you.
Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Intramural, I'm curious. I have a couple of questions. The first is, what are the consequences for increasing our debt to our credit rating as a city? And then the second question that I have is, what are the consequences for us choosing to not issue more debt in order to cover these costs?
So, Chair Palmisano and Councilmember Cunningham, I do not believe that there would be a direct impact on the city's credit rating to take on this amount of debt. It's a relatively small amount of debt in comparison to our total portfolio and our general budget. Certainly, if Mr. Ruff or Ms. Johnson, who are on the call, would like to chime in, they are welcome to. To answer your second question, sorry, remind me your second question. It slipped from my mind.
Yes, what are the consequences of not
Thank you.
Pursuing this particular path?
Yep. So thank you. It's unfortunate that I forgot that question because it was such a good one and it's well timed. So the consequence of not engaging in any one of these measures means the others need to be relied on to a heavier extent. And so in total, the mayor has proposed a set of a path to solve for a $98 million remaining shortfall. And to the extent we don't engage in any one of the strategies, we need to pick up that slack in another one. So if we don't issue debt for capital, then later on I'll be talking about reducing operating programs or leaning heavier into our use of cash or leaning heavier into payroll savings measures such as furloughs, budgetary leave, or layoffs. So if we were to do less here, that would mean doing more of one of those, leaning harder into one of those strategies.
Thank you. I'll follow up after I hear from my colleagues. Thanks.
Director Intermill, just a quick follow-up to that. Also, these are for specific capital projects in 2020 that to some degree were already underway, right? So just stopping them would put us in a strange place in terms of the projects that are queued up for 2020. Is that your understanding?
Chair Palmisano, that is correct. Later, you'll hear about other capital projects that were not initiated and which are being delayed or deferred to later years. But these are, to my knowledge, already underway.
Thank you. We have a few more council members in queue before you move on. Councilmember Schrader.
Thank you, Chair Palmisano. And Director Intermill, actually, my question is mainly a continuation of Councilmember Cunningham's. Just what are the long-term effects? And it sounds you answered it for this slide, but I think going forward, one of the big questions I have is just how this is going to impact our 2021, 2022, and 2023 budgets. How this is going to impact our levy. It sounds like for this, just switching over from cash to debt will not have as big an effect, but I'm assuming some of the other ones will. So it'd just be helpful to know when we're going to be taking a bigger levy hit or something, or a proposed bigger levy hit, because I think we need to make sure that we're balancing that all right. And what I'm trying to avoid is making a decision now that's going to really hurt us later. And I know it's hard to predict in the next couple of years what kind of aid we may get, but assuming the worst, that we do not get that, I want to make sure that we're prepared for that.
Yep. Chair Palmisano and Councilmember Schrader, I think that if this strategy is adopted, then we'll work with our debt and investments team to finalize the structure of the debt payments. Typically, we try to engage in shorter term borrowing so that the impact is felt for only a few years rather than a 30-year approach. And so what that means is that the $5.3 million in the general fund, for instance, if we were to pay that off over 5 years, we could expect somewhere in the neighborhood of needing to add $1.2 million or so to our debt levy, and beyond what is contemplated in our 5-year financial direction for each of those years. So that's sort of the magnitude. If we were to do a 5-year payback, if we did a 10-year payback, then that amount gets cut in half. But the overall cost grows due to the additional interest payments with a longer debt issue.
Thank you. I know we had gone through some of these in our initial conversations with council leadership in the mayor's office, and these are important questions to get out in the public realm in terms of how we're being careful about those concerns, quite frankly. Council President Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And as you reflected, I've been asking a lot of these kinds of questions in our budget meetings about financial sustainability. I wondered if, because so many questions are in this vein, if you could take a step back, Director Intermill, and talk about what assumptions you're making or projections around how long the budget is expected to shift in terms of revenue decreases because of the pandemic and the economic recession that we're in, and then how it relates to these decisions. So for example, if we assume we're in a 5-year recession, a 5 to 10 year payback period means that we would be paying off debt during a time that we would likely still be seeing revenue decreases in our budget.
Thank you, Chair Palmisano and Council President Bender. It's a good question to ask. I have an unsatisfying answer, which is, largely we don't know, and there's conflicting thought. And I think, as with many things related to the pandemic, there was much discussion at the beginning back in March, and then that's trailed off. But back in March, there was a lot of conversation about a U-shaped recovery or a V-shaped recovery, meaning we know that on the front end there's a sharp drop to the economic activity. And then are we going to be in a recession for a long time, or are we going to rebound quickly? So a long time would be more of a U-shaped trough and a long recession with a quicker recovery, similar to what we saw in the Great Recession? Or are we in a place where the economic fundamentals, meaning the strength of the financial services industry, the strength of the real estate market, are so strong that as soon as the pandemic crisis is solved, the financial crisis will be solved immediately on its heels, and that would give us more of a V-shaped recovery. I think that several months ago when we were talking about this, I mentioned that as we talk to different cities around the country, one city that brought up an alternative path is more of a Nike swoosh, which is to say a sharp decline, a medium-sized trough, and then a longer tailed recovery. That resonates with us in finance at the city. And so that's likely what we're to see. And when the state of Minnesota released its sort of unprecedented forecast that came out in May, typically they do economic forecasts in February and November. That May forecast showed a Nike swoosh type recovery. And so we do expect, following that guidance, that we will recover in the 2 to 3 year time period, with sort of a quicker recovery at the beginning and a longer tail to the end. Not a 5-year recovery, but I think there is a large caveat there that we simply don't know. We don't have a crystal ball to help us see the future on this. But that's where, as the slide shows, there is that policy consideration. Do we go with a shorter payback so that we can move past the measure that needed to be taken today to solve this problem, or do we structure a longer payback so that we can engage in other activities that are needed to support the city and its residents and businesses as they too are both impacted by and key components of the general economic recovery.
Thank you, Mr. Intermill, for that explanation. If I might add one piece of this that my colleagues will recognize as part of this process, all of these are projections, right? And as time moves on, we get a little bit more certain in are able to calibrate those projections a little bit more precisely. You'll remember that at the beginning, when we thought we'd be taking on this exercise in June, the amount of money that we were going to try to cut from the city's budget was $165 million. A month later, those same projections, 1 month more certain in terms of COVID-related costs, really was more like $156 million, which is the exercise that we're in now. Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A comment and a question. Right now, without getting external sources of revenue to the city, we are relying on property taxes. And this is concerning to me because it will create pressure to increase property taxes at a time that people will not be able to afford to pay more in property taxes. We're also more reliant on local government aid, and we can see how well we're doing at the state with getting the CARES fund that we're even entitled to. So I'm worried about the fact that we're relying on sources which put pressure on those who are the most vulnerable, generally lower income people and renters who have more of a burden on property taxes. So I think it's important to note that we should be cutting where we can cut, not shifting where we can shift. So that gets me to my question. Why are we even doing these things? I understand within the parking fund, part of the planning is for the impound lot. And the impound lot is, 100 years old, and people are waiting in a double wide trailer in the freezing cold with no heat, and our employees are working in terrible situations, and we're about to let contracts. Okay, that makes sense to me. But like this parks and streets deal, I'm not going to get into what I think about what's happening with the park system right now. But needless to say, I don't think we should be putting extra money into that line item with the risk that we're going to have to increase property taxes. So I'm wondering specifically under the parks and roads deal, where are we at with, are they ready to let contracts on specific road projects and specific capital improvements in parks right now that we have to do this? Or why wouldn't we almost unwind that entire deal, which would put 15 million plus more into the city's coffers, and we can figure out, for example, how to deal with unsheltered homeless people in parks with that $15 million. So there's a little bit of politics, there's a little bit of policy, but overall, I'm just wondering why we're even considering doing all of these things. And if the answer is, well, we're halfway through the year and we have to finish these, but we'll go after it next year, that would make me feel better. But I don't really see very many reductions. This entire thing is like all about shifting things. Even in affordable housing, I don't want to cut out of affordable housing. We're taking $4 million from the joint board, we're moving it to cover the $6 million. So we're not cutting anything. So I'm just interested in what the strategy is. Is it kind of defer? Because I just heard you say to Councilmember Bender, we're looking at a 2 to 3 year recovery. So maybe for 2 to 3 years, we shouldn't be doing any capital projects so that we don't put pressure on property taxpayers. That is my main, and license holders. I'm all in favor of we shouldn't be charging for licenses for businesses that aren't open. Come downtown, you could see no one's open. Talk to anyone in restaurants, they're unemployed. This isn't going to end anytime soon. So I'm interested in what the overall strategy is to cut things. Chair Palmisano and Councilmember Goodman, I do think that there are a substantial amount of cuts, both in phase one and phase one, which the council has already adopted, and phase two, as proposed by the mayor yesterday. The $58 million of cuts in phase one were truly reductions from the budget. I think, as I said in my prepared remarks a few minutes ago, this really is this overall strategy really is the only shift of funding, setting aside the things that we'll talk about a little bit more specifically in some of the change items there. But on net, the entire programming reduction cost containment strategy is a reduction to expense. So I think that there are reductions. I think your point is well taken, that we do need to be careful and mindful of the impacts that today's actions have on tomorrow. And this is one of those actions, perhaps one of the few actions that does shift costs to tomorrow.
But I think that this plan in total is making some hard choices, and there are additional hard choices that can be made as well. With respect to Parks and Streets specifically, yes, I think it's fair to characterize it that we're continuing this year because the work has been programmed and is happening, as we speak, and there is the opportunity to revisit the question entirely for 2021 and beyond. If there are questions on the specifics of the projects, I know that Director Robin Hutchison is here and can speak more, certainly more intelligently to where we are with those streets investments.
Good morning, Chair Palmisano, Councilmember Goodman, and council members. I'll speak generally to the general fund portion of it, in that very often we have projects that take more than a year. And we have numerous projects that started last year and continue into this year. We also have projects that began really mobilizing even prior to COVID that would be considered underway. And these are projects that we do need to finish in 2020. We don't like to leave, holes and projects half done for our community. So it's important that we finish our 2020 program as planned to reduce a pretty widespread community impact. So that is for 2020. Our thinking will likely be very different for 2021. And I think that Director Intermill is showing you that we're securing the 2020 program and not suggesting that this be the strategy for 2021. We are all thinking about 2021 in a different way. For the parking fund, Councilmember Goodman, you're absolutely right. The impound lot, very much underway, very much needed. We found ourselves 3 years ago in a very, very secure position with the parking fund and made a decision to pay cash for the impound lot and for the parking meter project that we knew was coming. That actually was a good thing because we had an opportunity for 2020 to come back and reverse that decision and bond for it, which we could have done a few years ago. And we decided to do now in order to be able to move forward with those two projects. They are necessary. One is the impound lot. The other is the required update to the city's parking meter system.
So if there are no additional questions, we could move to the next slide. The next strategy included in this proposal is to reduce one-time programming by $23.6 million across all funds. Understandably, this will be one of the more difficult conversations, as the mayor highlighted yesterday. This will cut directly at some of the most visible work of the city. As you'll recall, one of the phase 1 cost containment measures cut base funded contracting or ongoing programming by 15%. This strategy cuts, with one exception, one-time investments, as the slide says, in city operations, professional services contracts, and in capital expenses. Though I can't speak to the why of a given decision, I can tell you that when taking on this strategy, the mayor and his team focused on 3 areas. They first looked to where have the general conditions changed enough between last December and today where a given change item may no longer be the best investment the city can make. Second, they looked at where the dollars still available, where are dollars still available, meaning what's left yet uncommitted or unspent. More bluntly, we can't save money that's already been spent, so let's look at what's available. Third, they considered where staff time is currently so heavily focused on pandemic response that dollars simply cannot be deployed for the intended purpose. I believe I've said this before to each of you, and I'll say it again today. It's not possible to reduce our planned spending by 10% without reducing the work those dollars were intended to buy. With that in mind, I suggest that some of the primary policy considerations here are, with these cuts, can we still advance our goals? Can we do less but still move in the right direction, or at least not lose ground? And perhaps most importantly, are we still living our truth? Do our expenditures still align with our values, most notably the commitment of this body, the mayor, and every department to work to advance racial equity at the city of Minneapolis in our work and for the advancement of all who live, work, and recreate here? Individual cuts are identified by department, fund, and change item on subsequent slides. As Chair Palmisano mentioned, department heads are on hand to answer specific questions you may have. If there are any general questions about this strategy, I'm happy to answer those now, or we can move into the specifics.
I think a general question from Council President Bender.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I jumped in because I wanted to ask a higher level question, and I'm sure there'll be feedback and on the specifics as well. But both for this and the next strategy of using cash balances, you know, I have, again, like another structural question about our budget, which is that usually we use ongoing revenue for ongoing expenses. So an ongoing expense is the salary for a full-time employee, which we assume will be employed by the city unless future policymakers choose to shift the budget. And we typically use ongoing revenue sources for those ongoing costs. But this budget cut proposal is using one-time expenses, one-time cuts, either cuts in one-time expenses or cash to fill those ongoing costs. And it's another way of asking the question, the kinds of questions you were getting on the last slide, which is this really a sustainable way to prepare for our budget for this year and then the next several years to come? I'll also add that my understanding is that the proposed levy to maintain current service levels after these cuts would be 14% for the 2021 budget. And so I'm just concerned that these cuts are focused in a very short-term way using one-time dollars and will be sort of kicking the can down the road for a budget situation that I think will last for at least several years.
Chair Palmisano and Councilmember Bender, it's a good question. It's a smart question. I think that that is absolutely the choice that needs to be made. I do think that it's making ongoing cuts mid-year is more challenging than it may appear on its face. And what I mean by that is particularly when we look at our largest ongoing expense, which is our staff cost, our payroll expense, layoffs don't save dollar for dollar in the immediate. We are a reimbursing employer, which essentially in plain speak is that we self-insure for unemployment insurance. And so if and when we lay off staff, we are responsible for paying those unemployment insurance costs. And so a layoff nets savings down the road and gets to some of that structural balance that you speak to, but in order to achieve the level of savings that are required to solve the immediate problem, we would have to go very deep in order to balance in this year. And so I think it's certainly a choice. The mayor was clear and said multiple times his primary goal was to avoid massive layoffs in 2020. If the council wants to take a slightly different approach and wants to focus more on those ongoing cuts, whether they be to staffing or programming, that is certainly an option in front of you over the next few weeks as we head to an adoption of this revised budget on the 24th. But it's the reality is there are no easy answers, and I think it is you're correct in the assertion that we should try and balance both our immediate needs and our future needs.
Thank you. Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is a high-level question, and I'm sure that we will get into more specifics. But I have to ask, you talk about the three themes: conditions changed, what money is still available, staff time related to the pandemic response. So one of the concerns that I have is that a consideration explicitly is not racial equity. You know, so from a high level perspective, how did the strategic and racial equity action plan get incorporated into this decision-making process, since that's our main lens for analysis, as well as the racial equity impact analysis? Like, how was that incorporated into it? Because I'm just very concerned that this is not explicitly named as we're talking about the cuts.
Thank you, Chair Palmisano and Councilmember Cunningham. You're right. I failed to explicitly mention that as a piece of the thinking. I do, whether it's my own privilege or just my particular orientation, I take that as a granted in the given decision making, particularly as that strategic and racial equity action plan was developed jointly by mayor and council, and my understanding of it is that it is an articulation of shared values, and so I think that from my perspective, that that values assessment is inherent in the choices, if not called out explicitly on a slide or in my remarks.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Director. I'm not seeing any other questions, so why don't we go ahead.
Can we have the next slide, please? In the city clerk's office, the mayor actually, before I jump in there, I should note the listing of adjustments that you'll see in the coming slides are not exhaustive of all of the one-time change items in the 2020 budget. There are one-time change items that are left untouched, and so those aren't discussed in the coming slides. What I've shared with you here are exclusively the cuts proposed by the mayor. So first, in the city clerk's office, the mayor recommends reducing the LIMS Phase 3 change item by $50,000. This general fund change item supports the continued development of the city's legislative information management system, or LIMS, specifically to extend the system's functionality to include the city's 3 planning and quasi-judicial bodies. City Clerk Casey Carl and I are here to answer questions on this recommendation. If there are none, we can move on to the next slide. In the city coordinator's office, the mayor recommends adjustments to 6 items that come to a net reduction in spending of $125,000. The first reduction is to the Creative City Challenge, an entry-level project supporting emerging public artists. This item would be reduced by $70,000 in the general fund. The second reduction is to enterprise engagement. This is a pool of funds available to all departments to advance equitable engagement by leveraging the right communications tools to engage diverse communities. This item would be reduced by $20,000 in the general fund. The third reduction is to partnerships, specifically the Doors Open event, which will not be occurring in 2020 due to the pandemic. This item would be reduced by $10,000 in the general fund. The fourth reduction is to partnerships, specifically Kajug, a 4-H club focused on enriching the lives of Somali American youth. This item would be reduced by $20,000 in the general fund. The fifth reduction is to the Promise Zone for contract work on economic development in the North Minneapolis Promise Zone. This item would be reduced by $5,000 in the general fund. The sixth and final adjustment is to renters' legal support. This is a change item from the 2019 budget planned to be spent in 2019 and 2020 on a renters' legal support program. This recommendation is to substitute federal funds for general funds, yielding no net impact to the program, while saving approximately $400,000 in the general fund. I should say the federal funds that are being used were part of the pool recently made available by the federal government in the additional emergency solutions grant that we received. There will be no net impact to the program while saving approximately $400,000 in the general fund. City Coordinator Mark Ruff and I are here to answer questions on this set of recommendations.
We do have a question or comment from Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you very much, Chair Palmisano. I guess my question, it has to do, well, I know my question has to do with the renter's legal support, and the way it was sounding, this was $400,000 that wouldn't have been spent on anything else, but just fell out of the air from the federal government. And I believe we did have a discussion about how we were going to use these resources, and the council already made a commitment to put them towards some uses. Is there anybody here who can remind us what we were intending and had prioritized the $400,000 for that came from the federal government, or if we had at all?
Madam Chair and Councilmember Gordon, I would defer to Interim Director of Community Planning and Economic Development, Andrea Brennan, or to City Coordinator Mark Ruff on that question.
And if we don't know right now, we can certainly look it up, but maybe somebody can confirm that this was indeed part of some action that we took or in the middle of taking, having to do with this. And I think we even got more than 400,000 anticipated.
If it's all right with you, unless somebody's ready to jump in, I would suggest maybe we come back to that to give Andrea Brennan a bit of time to kind of look that up, or our city coordinator, Coordinator Ruff, did I hear you start to talk there?
You did, Madam Chair. This is Mark Ruff, the city coordinator. Councilmember Gordon, if I understand your question correctly, what Director Intermill is referring to is we're not reducing expenditures, we're just changing the source of the expenditures from the general fund to additional federal funds that we received as a result of a different part of the CARES Act funding that came directly to the city, and that was both CDBG and ESG money. You have taken action on a revised plan for how to spend that money, but there has been additional monies that we'll be receiving that you will be also then taking additional action on how to spend that money. And so that is in a process, but our recommendation is to replace general fund money with this federal money.
That makes some sense. I don't think we necessarily have acted on the CARES funding specifically, so that's good to hear. Perhaps Andrea Brennan wants to also weigh in on it, but thanks.
Yeah, I'm gonna ask Andrea put her name in the queue, and so before Councilmember Goodman goes, I'm going to call on the Interim Director Brennan.
You don't need me. I was going to answer for Andrea and say she's on top of this, but she's there now, so you can have her.
There you go. She's also saying that the coordinator answered the question, but is there anything else that you wanted to add, Andrea? Sorry about that.
Hi, Andrea Brennan, Interim Director of CPED. I can just add that we are working on an action to bring forward to the City Council using the Federal CARES Act funds through the CDBG additional funding allocation. We are working on a council action to bring forward to you, hopefully in the next cycle, that would both replace these funds as well as request additional funding for legal services. So in addition to just replacing the funds here, we're proposing to supplement those funds to, number one, address what we think could potentially be a surge in eviction filings after the evictions moratorium ban ends, which thankfully we do not expect to happen next week, but will happen eventually. As well as ensure that we can fund legal services throughout 2021 to again ensure continuity of service as well as increased service to meet an increase in demand.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful. I appreciate it.
Madam Chair, I also appreciate it, and this strikes me as a good time to add just my thanks and recognition of every department engaging in this effort. Departments have not only been going above and beyond in working to respond to the pandemic and to respond to the civil unrest, but they've also taken on additional work to respond to this, the financial emergency we find ourselves in. So again, one of those things that I often take for granted, but am never shy to highlight.
Yeah, not just our financial emergency, but that of our city's residents. Council President Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to note that this question that we talked about a little bit yesterday, and Director Intermill and you followed up about, which is I had asked for some more information and a race equity analysis to the 15% contract cuts that we approved as part of the phase 1 more administrative approach. And I do just want to acknowledge that these one-time cuts are coming from one-time expenses that were approved in last year's budget. And so in both of those areas, in the contract cuts as well as in these one-time cuts, I do think it is very worth us taking the time to dig in and understand if there are other types of work happening or other ongoing expenses or programs that may be a lower priority than some of these investments that are very clearly related to our shared priorities of race equity. So, and I think the two are related. Again, a lot of the race equity work that we are doing is investing in community organizations. So I know that we are on a tight timeline, but I just did want to note that I think it is 100% appropriate and important for council members to dig in to those details and just really make sure that the cuts are in the areas that make the most sense related to our priorities, as well as understand, where else within our department's budgets may be a lower priority. And of course, that's work that will have to happen ongoing for the 2021 budget and likely for many years after. But I don't think people should feel discouraged or like they shouldn't be asking detailed questions about some of these community investments.
Sure. Madam Chair and Council President, I wholeheartedly agree. An update on the specific request for additional information related to the 15% cut. Yesterday, immediately following the mayor's remarks, my team did reach back out to any departments we've not yet heard from, and our goal is to get you that information on Monday next week.
Thank you so much for that. I know that's a lot of work, but I think worth the time and effort. So thank you to you and all the department heads for participating in that.
Absolutely. If there are no other questions on the city coordinator slide, we'll move to the next slide. Excuse me. At the convention center and Target Center, the mayor recommends reductions of $11.2 million in capital expenses. So these are some of those expenditures that are being postponed and foregone in the 2020 year. So the first recommendation is to postpone $10.2 million of interior remodeling and important but non-critical equipment and infrastructure projects at the convention center. The second recommendation is to postpone $1 million of infrastructure and technology upgrades at the Target Center, which were not included in the recent renovation. Minneapolis Convention Center Executive Director Jeff Johnson and I are here to answer questions you may have on these two recommendations. Seeing none in the queue, I will
actually. Director, I'm gonna pause here and call on Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you. I just think that it might be beneficial for us to have a little more background information about it. I will have to say, when we look at the convention center that hasn't been used and the Target Center, and we see that there's a willingness to release this much money into those improvements, which I guess is incredibly helpful. But then we're seeing that we're still spending 14, it looks like, actually over 14 million on the improvements. Is this really the right time for us to be spending $14 million on this when there are other critical needs? it's fine if somebody wants to make the case briefly here about how they came up with these figures, but it also might really be helpful for us to understand, and it might be in our judgment that we don't necessarily need these upgraded speakers and sound system or whatever they are, or the better lighting or new chairs. Right now, when we're looking at, you know, property tax increases and cutting services and other more critical areas that impact the health of our residents. So a brief comment now, and maybe I could do my own research, and you already have this provided, but maybe you could also point us to where we might see some kind of itemized list of what we're actually foregoing and what improvements we are continuing to make at such a large cost.
Yeah, these are general, but I might, if Mr. Johnson is on the phone, ask that after we conclude that he would be willing to at least just speak to that in general at the end of this presentation, if that's all right. Unless, Director, you have some feedback on that.
Madam Chair and Councilmember Gordon, I don't have specific feedback. I do think that Director Johnson would be the best person to respond.
Great, I'll reach out to him as you continue. Thank you. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. We have another person in queue, Councilmember Schrader.
Thank you, Chair Palmisano. Yesterday, the mayor talked about that it was, you know, fiscally smarter to not shut down the convention center and not do what I'm hearing from constituents, frankly, you know, is that, you know, nothing's happening at the convention center. Why are we still funding that? So I think it would be really helpful, I think, for the public to hear more of kind of what that entails and why it makes, you know, in theory, more sense to keep it open right now.
Yeah, I'll ask Mr. Johnson to respond to that. He actually puts himself in queue and says he's able to talk if needed. Mr. Johnson, did you want to pop in right now and share some details around that while we're on this topic?
Thank you, Chair Palmisano and both council members for your questions. As regards to the expenditures, most of those expenditures, actually all of those expenditures, are due to the fact that those projects are in flight, and so they have been happening. As Director Hutchison said, for Public Works, we have the same challenges that our projects take more than a year, and so those projects are under contract for the most part and underway, and so they are difficult to stop in a halfway nature. As regard to why the convention center is open or closed going forward, we do have contractual obligations to host events if we are allowed to host the events. The challenge that we have right now is we don't know when we will be able to host events again. And so it is difficult for us from a contractual standpoint to cancel events for the rest of the year because some of those events want to happen. And so we don't have the legal right to cancel those until our building is not available. And without knowing when we will be available, again, that puts us in this very difficult place going forward. So that's why we are staying at the ready. We are starting to host actually next week some events that are under 250 people. Obviously, those are not events that generally a building as large as we are would want to host on a regular basis, but we are starting to do that in response to those needs.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful and an important clarifying point. Councilmember Gordon also asks about the Target Center. How about contracts that might be operating out of Target Center?
Chair Palmisano, Councilmember Gordon. So again, these cuts that we are proposing are for more of the capital improvements. So again, many of the expenses that the $6.8 million are expenses that we're actually engaged in and closing out. And so we have contracts with the different construction companies and others to complete those. And so we have stopped all future projects at this point. Other expenses for the Target Center really tie to debt payment that we have. So we can't, obviously, unless we restructure that debt, change that. And then contractual obligations that we have with our partner, the operator of the Target Center. So again, difficult to stop those payments also.
Thank you. That's really helpful here. And I think that adds a lot of context to these numbers. Councilmember Gordon, do you have any other further thoughts? Councilmember Gordon, you might be on mute.
Sorry about that. Thanks. This is all helpful information. I will just note that when it's $10,200,000, that's an awfully round number, and when it's $1 million, that's an awfully round number. And why couldn't it be $1,500,000 or $1,055,000 if we wanted to recover some other thing that we're cutting when we're looking at this? So some kind of itemized list might be helpful. I understand that we do have contracts that are out there and all those things, but I suspect that these numbers weren't necessarily based on every cent that was going to be spent and sent out there. So I'd like to better understand what flexibility there might still be left in these numbers as we're making such significant commitments of investments in potential buildings that we own and control. So if we could prevent some kind of layoffs or some other things, I think we should still explore that. So maybe I can dig into this a little bit more offline, but I just wanted to note that. But thanks for the explanations.
Thank you.
Madam Chair and Councilmember Gordon, if I may, I'll take full ownership of the numbers as they're presented on the slide. I find it easier to speak in round numbers. We certainly have the detail, and we can share that with you. So moving to the next slide, please. Community planning and economic development, the mayor recommends adjustments to 10 items that come to a net reduction in spending of $2,065,000. The first reduction is to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, through which gap financing is provided for the production and preservation of affordable rental housing. This item would be reduced by $225,000 in the general fund. I do want to note the original amount shown on the slide in front of you speaks only to the general fund monies going to the trust fund in 2020. An additional $9 million of appropriation from other funds remains in the 2020 budget. The second adjustment is an increase to the Commercial Property Development Fund. So again, this is an increase, and this increases the availability of patient capital available to be lent on favorable terms to commercial development projects located in economically challenged areas. This item would be increased by $260,000. The third adjustment is to the Cooperative Technical Assistance Program, or CTAP. Funds have been designated to be deployed in conjunction with a cooperative public market for the Africa Village project in the Cedar Riverside neighborhood. I understand funds will not be needed this year. The item would be reduced by $50,000 in the general fund. The fourth adjustment is to the Co-op and Employee Owner Opportunity Fund. This is a new program set to launch in 2020 to help convert traditional businesses to employee ownership opportunities. This item would be reduced by $100,000 in the general fund. The fifth reduction is to Minneapolis Homes, a home ownership program which received much discussion at yesterday's POGO meeting. The item would be reduced by $750,000 in the general fund, but I understand from Interim CPED Director Andrea Brennan that one outcome of the consolidation of home ownership programs discussed at yesterday's POGO is the ability to share resources between existing programs and should not negatively impact this programming. The sixth adjustment is to funding that exists for the preservation of naturally occurring affordable housing. This item will be reduced by $1.45 million in the general fund, and $1 million of that reduction will be replenished with the return of unused funds from the Minneapolis-St. Paul Housing Finance Board. Next slide, please. The seventh reduction is to payday lending refinancing, which provided funds for contract with an entity or entities to provide no interest, no fee refinance loans for persons with payday lending loans. This item would be reduced by $75,000 in the general fund. The 8th adjustment is to Stable Homes, Stable Schools, the city's partnership with the Minneapolis Public Housing Agency and the public schools to provide housing stability for school children and their families. This item will be reduced by $3 million in the general fund. All $3 million of that reduction will be replenished with a return of unused funds from the Minneapolis-St. Paul Housing Finance Board, yielding no net change to this item. The 9th adjustment is to Village Financial, a 2019 change item that was rolled into 2020 for the purpose of developing a Black-owned credit union. This item would be reduced by $500,000 in the general fund, but notably a little over half of this reduction is that $260,000 is being used to support the increase to the Commercial Property Development Fund, the $260,000 I had just referenced. The 10th and final reduction in CPED is to the 4D program. This is the one base funded program being reduced through the overall strategy. I understand that program objectives can be met while still returning the $175,000 of the $250,000 base allocation for this item. This item would then indeed be reduced by $175,000 in the general fund. Interim CPED Director Andrea Brennan and I are here to answer any questions on this set of recommendations.
Thank you. Councilmember Schrader.
Thank you, Chair Palmisano. This is a question for Interim Director Brennan. If I could get just a little more detail about the $4 million reduction to the Joint Finance Board, kind of what services we won't see and why it was seemed, and just kind of the justification for taking $4 million out of there.
Sure. Andrea Brennan, Interim CPED Director, Madam Chair, Councilmember Schrader. The Joint Board was set up in the 1980s. It is a joint board with the city of St. Paul. And back then it was set up as basically a financing tool to be able to issue bonds for housing activities. Back in the 80s and the 90s, Minneapolis and St. Paul did a fair amount of this bond issuance, primarily for single family mortgage programs. Those programs are no longer cost effective for the cities to be involved in, primarily because Minnesota Housing has a program that covers both cities and they can implement these programs more cost effectively. At the time that several issuances of bonds were made by the Joint Board or issued by the Joint Board, there are certain funds that were required to be set up that allowed for payment of cost of issuance. And so over time, these balances have grown as bonds are paying off. And so right now, there is no annual budget really for the Joint Board, and the Joint Board, other than incurring expenses related to auditing fees and legal counsel for things like the low-income housing tax credit program, which again is administered jointly through this Joint Board for Minneapolis and St. Paul. So there are sort of operational costs that are paid from funds at the Joint Board. There is a need to have some balance in this cost of issuance fund, but the amount that's currently there far exceeds the amount that is needed for those operational purposes. So at this, staff did some analysis and determined that the amount that could be given to the city for this purpose is $4 million. But we do not anticipate that there will be anything that happens through the Joint Board that will not be able to occur as a result of this.
Thank you. Just a quick kind of follow-up comment. I think it'd be helpful to know, just like, is $4 million quite a substantial amount of money, how much is kind of built up over the years? I mean, the fact that if we're just paying for operational costs right now, but then there's a fund balance, that's other money that could have been used on more affordable housing or some of these other programs. I'm certainly happy that that $4 million is able to go to do some of the great program work that's happening now. It's just more of a question of transparency and accountability for previous years.
Absolutely. If I could just follow up, Councilmember Schrader, there, I think I mentioned there's an annual audit that is done by the joint board and any fund balances that are there, and that that audit is public information, and we can certainly follow up with more information specifically about the analysis that we did.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Brennan, I wondered if you could speak more to the 4D program. It seems like the confluence of economic hardship plus need for affordable housing plus potential levy increases would make it a great time to invest in the tax incentives to preserve affordable housing. But is there anything I'm missing, and can you talk more about that reduction?
Sure. Madam Chair, Council President Bender, this was actually a very easy reduction to make because the 4D program is completed for 2020. We received applications. We had, I think, about 500 units applied for the 2020 program, and we have advanced those. And the overall budget for the 4D program was $250,000. We needed $75,000 of that $250,000 in order to approve the 500 units that were approved. So this is really excess funds that are not needed for the program.
Great, thank you. And you don't anticipate this affecting future years of this program? Those investments would come in the 2021 budget, for example.
So, Madam Chair and Council President, I can jump in on that one. That is correct. This would be a one-time reduction to that ongoing funding. So it is a part of the current service level moving into 2021.
The cut is an ongoing cut?
Sorry. To clarify, no, the funding is ongoing. The cut is one time. So the base going into 2021 is $250,000.
Great. This was all my understanding of what was going on. Thank you for clarifying.
You bet.
Yeah.
Thank you, Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Back to the joint board question. I have been the chair of the joint board for 4 years, and I've served with Council Members Gordon and Ellison on the joint board. I want to note that St. Paul has taken their excess revenue out of the joint board in a way that we have not. So we have had a fund balance over time, and we have not touched it, and now we're going to do what St. Paul did, which was use that for other reasons. We're actually having a meeting of the joint board to discuss this, I think next week, if not the week after. So this seems to be administrative from St. Paul's side, since this is something they have done with their share of the excess revenue. It's just not something that we had ever contemplated, that in an emergency now we're contemplating it. And I'll note that Councilmember Gordon and Ellison have been at all the meetings and will be at that meeting as well.
Thank you. Councilmember Jenkins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Intermill, can you just speak a little bit more about the village financial situation? I'm not sure if I fully understand. You mentioned 250,000. So I just need a little more clarity.
Certainly, Chair Palmisano and Council Vice President Jenkins, the full $500,000 allocated for Village Financial is being recommended to be eliminated. However, 260,000 of that then is being that is the increase that you see on the previous slide to the Commercial Property Development Fund. And I did speak with Sean Pierce in the mayor's office this morning, and she highlighted that where Village is in its work right now is really looking at opening space, and so that is activity that could certainly be eligible for use of the Commercial Property Development Fund, and so that is the action that is reflected in this action.
Has there been communication with the Village Financial folks?
Chair Palmisano and Council Vice President, I believe that the mayor's office has been in contact with folks associated with the program.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just continuing with the village financial cuts, one of the things that happened with the 2020 budget was that there was $500,000 that had been proposed. I had expressed concerns about that, and then I have been reassured that it's okay. We're rolling over $500,000 from last year that hasn't been spent, and so now we're talking about cutting that. I understand if Village Financial specifically is not ready for that, for whatever the requirements were to be able to spend the dollars. For me, it's more about the fact that it was investing in Black economic power. And yes, Black folks will benefit from, some Black folks will benefit from the Commercial Property Development Fund, so I don't want to erase that impact. This is about Black economic power specifically, and so I just have some concerns about the lack of investing directly into Black-led, Black-serving organizations that focus on wealth building. Like, there are ways for us to continue potentially investing that $500,000 into specifically building Black economic power. That is a concern that I have that feels like it is not in alignment with our values of closing racial disparities that disproportionately impact Black folks. So it's like Village Financial was, or is, a project that we kind of put up on this pedestal as like the, that represented us as a city investing in Black economic power, but the underlying purpose was to do that. The positive outcome from that investment would be a Black-led, Black-serving credit union. But the underlying intention was building Black economic power and wealth. That, now I know that we as a city cannot say this money is specifically for Black people. Like, I understand that, and I'm not advocating for us to go against that law and expectation, but there are more direct ways that we would be able to continue to invest directly in community-based organizations that are doing this work, that are Black-led, Black-serving. So I just, this particular cut, I mean, I'm glad to see that it's going to the Commercial Property Development Fund. You know, I think that that is a really critical program. In Ward 4, we have like next to no commercial real estate, and we really need that if we're going to be helping Black and brown business owners or entrepreneurs to be able to have brick and mortar spaces. So again, I don't want to undermine that impact. I just don't feel great about the proposal to remove money that we're making a cut specifically around building Black economic power, even if that's specifically not going to Village Financial. That doesn't feel like that aligns with our values and what we have committed to as a city. So I just want to name that specifically, that, you know, that money could be reallocated in other ways. I know that we're looking for cuts right now, but some of that money was reallocated. So, you know, if we're looking at how do we fully align with our values, that particular component does not feel like that's aligned with our values. So I just wanted to name that in this space.
Thank you, Councilmember. I'm just going to accept that as some feedback. Council President Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to ask Director Brennan about the reduction in funding for preservation of affordable housing. And I know that it's been a bit challenging to get that money spent because of our challenges of competing in the real estate market with private investors, but also just wanted to hear more about the status of that program related to these cuts. And I also recall that maybe even last term, I think we did set aside a portion of our financial investment portfolio for the use of preservation of affordable housing. So I wanted to make sure that that policy is still in place, and perhaps that could be used to backstop any cuts if there are opportunities that present themselves to preserve affordable housing.
Sure, Madam Chair, Council President, the proposed cuts to the NOAA preservation programs would, potentially reduce some ability to acquire and preserve NOAA property. The challenge, I think, that you named is that we don't have a lot of control over when those opportunities come. We certainly are out looking for them very proactively, but it takes a willing seller and a lot of circumstances to fall in line for those to be viable potential acquisitions. So the good news is that we've had NOAA preservation programs now for 3 years, and as of still early this year, we were carrying forward balances, and now with some really important preservation acquisitions by nonprofit partners and the Land Bank Twin Cities, we don't have any balances from previous years. However, when looking at where where funds potentially could be cut, NOAA preservation programs are certainly an area where we can't 100% guarantee that we can deploy all of those resources in 2020. We do have one acquisition that's in the pipeline, so the funds that are remaining will be sufficient to certainly go forward with that acquisition and preservation, as well as to hopefully seek additional preservation. So we do expect that activity will continue and that we will be able to respond to opportunities. And we've also learned through the NOAA preservation work that it's really important to be flexible and nimble. So if we are presented with an opportunity to preserve NOAA property, we've heard very strong interest on the part of the City Council that is a priority. So staff would have the ability to move forward and request that Council consider some reallocation of resources at that time, so that we can accommodate that kind of opportunity if it does arise.
Great, that's all very helpful, and I think especially that last piece, I think, is the important part, and I would be happy, I think, even to bring forward a more official direction from the Council clarifying that this remains a priority, and we wouldn't want staff to stop seeking opportunities for this investment. And maybe we'll also follow up with you and Finance about ways that we could design future investments in NOAA so that they are flexible, so that we don't have money sitting around unused, but that we are able to take advantage of every opportunity as it becomes available. So I appreciate that a lot. I also think that this is a tool that will become increasingly important as one strategy related to the ordinance that staff is working on with a number of council members around, requiring the first right of refusal. I'm not using the right word for the ordinance, but the requirement to offer building sale directly to the tenants. That would of course require financial resources, opportunity to purchase. Thank you, Councilmember Gordon. And I have thought of our NOAA preservation funds as one tool that could help take advantage of that policy change and create investment for cooperative housing like you did with the Corcoran 5 buildings in the future. So thanks for indulging in those details on this really important program.
Thank you. Mr. Innermill, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Chair Palmisano. If we can advance 2 slides. Great. In Finance and Property Services, the mayor recommends reducing the asset management strategy by $145,000. This general fund change item lays the groundwork to build a system that incorporates data from all major city asset categories, think about vehicles, buildings, roads, etc., into one format to aid in budget prioritization, financial reporting, and risk management. Interim Chief Finance Officer Lori Johnson and I are here to answer any questions you have on this recommendation. Seeing none, if we could go to the next slide. Oh, there perhaps was.
Sorry, I'm going to pause you there and call on Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you. Just very quickly, if we could go back to the last slide. So this is, I think for most folks, like a pretty dry line item, but I do just want to be able to pause and say quickly that this is actually a really critical need if we are going to leverage all of our assets as a city, between the land that we own, the as was mentioned, the fleet. Like, we have a lot of assets that we are not taking into consideration in a thoughtful, organized way. This is a common issue across cities. I've done a lot of work and research around the public wealth of cities, and this is something that is recommended as a fundamental starting place to really leverage our publicly owned assets as a way to be able to build public wealth rather than having to continuously rely on just property taxes, for example, as a revenue stream. So I understand that we're cutting because we have to cut, but I just want to name that, like, while this is kind of dry and it's easy to be like, okay, we're not going to do that, that does have budgetary and financial implications. I just wanted to name that. It's not I don't have a question, but just wanted to name that so we didn't just quite glide over that. Thanks.
Chair Palmisano, if you're okay with me responding, I do appreciate Councilmember Cunningham raising the issue. This is actually a change item that lives specifically in my division budget. And on this change item, I can give a little bit more detail, which is to say, first, the reason it's being reduced by $145,000 rather than $150,000 is because $5,000 was spent. Robert Harrison, our principal budget analyst, and I went out to Washington, D.C. to learn from our counterparts out there about this particular topic that they have done a lot of leading work in. And so that knowledge is not lost, though the dollars are being reduced here. And on top of that, just yesterday evening, I met with our Chief Information Officer, Fadi Fadil, and we talked about restarting this project from a staff team perspective, just to, again, do some of that groundwork that doesn't require dollars to be spent on a particular system or additional travel to learn from more partners, but to start thinking with our IT partners, and we will eventually engage our public works partners as well in the important work. And I raised that just to illustrate, to contradict myself a little bit earlier when I said that less work would get done. That's not absolute, and there is some opportunity for staff to continue to be creative, much to the conversation we just had about continuing to prioritize the work as directed by the council. So thanks for allowing me that indulgence. If we could go to the next slide. In the health department, the mayor recommends adjustments to 5 change items that come to a reduction of spending of $166,250. The first reduction is to funding available to implement 3 of the 16 items listed in the Fast Track Initiative Action Plan. This item would be reduced by $50,000 in the general fund. The second reduction is to funds appropriated to hire temporary health inspectors. This item would be reduced by $55,000 in the general fund. The third reduction is to healthy living and low-income housing, which allows for expanded contracts with housing partners for public health awareness and comprehensive wellness in public housing. This item would be reduced by $25,000 in the general fund. The fourth reduction is to Youth Coordinating Board, which is appropriated funds through the health department. Specifically, these funds are related to contracting available to help develop children's savings accounts. This item would be reduced by $6,250 in the general fund. The fifth reduction is also to the Youth Coordinating Board, specifically related to part-time youth workers in the Cedar, Riverside, and Seward neighborhoods. This item would be reduced by $30,000 in the general fund. Commissioner of Health Gretchen Musicant and I are here to answer questions on these recommendations.
If I could pause you here and call on Councilmember Cunningham again and then Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you. Sorry to be talking so much. This is obviously a particular area of importance for me and my community that I represent. So I first just want to make sure that we name for the record that Fast Track is specifically focused on reducing and treating HIV. That wasn't named, so I just want to make sure that folks understand that this is a cut to HIV-related funding. I just feel like these are generally like pretty small amounts of money that have really big impacts, and so I just have some serious concerns about these cuts. But particularly, I am concerned about the youth workers in Cedar Riverside and Seward. First of all, like, we don't have a lot of investments specifically in young people in those neighborhoods, and we have seen an uptick in violence and negative maladaptive behaviors that are coming up for young people in those neighborhoods. And so this is a critical intervention that we're talking about cutting. And this is on top of the public safety goal being that we want young people to be connected to positive youth development programming. And so like that runs directly in the face, something that disproportionately impacts Somali youth in particular, that we are cutting that. This is a small amount of money on the grand scheme of things, but yet it has such a big impact. And so I am deeply concerned, particularly that we're making this cut without a Ward 6 council member to be able to say, like, I am not okay with this money being cut because it's desperately needed. As a youth advocate, I feel a moral responsibility to say that it is not okay to cut this money, given our commitment to racial equity, our public safety goal being directly, specifically focused on young people. Those two things together should not allow $30,000 of a meager $50,000 in the first place to be cut. I mean, the fact that they're even part-time, they're more than part-time, but getting paid for part-time. I could pull apart the inequity, like how it's racially inequitable to be making these cuts in the other areas, but I particularly feel strongly about the youth workers funding being cut. There are so many cuts that happen with young people in particular, like with looking at the children's savings accounts, like that is connected with long-term lower crime rates. Like we are talking about public safety, and then we are cutting the upstream strategies that we know will prevent young people from either immediately engaging in violence or down the road engaging in violence. And here we are cutting that. So I have some pretty serious concerns about those particular areas, as well as the fast track. I think that the city's not investing nearly enough already at all in HIV related work.
I appreciate that, Councilmember. If Director Intermill wants to respond, he can. I do want to flag the part-time youth workers as something that we talked a lot about in our discussions between leadership and the mayor's office. I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, these part-time youth workers weren't youth themselves. This isn't like a summer employment kind of program. But we also had partnerships money in Cedar Riverside for youth, including 60 to 80,000 in Kajug youth programming and additional funding for both the Cedar Riverside Partnership and the Riverside Opportunity Center that are all doing very similar work here. But it was flagged as a concern for the reasons that you mentioned by myself and Councilmember Jenkins. Mr. Intermill, is there anything you wanted to mention specific to the comments from Councilmember Cunningham? I see we have several more council members in queue. Okay, then Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you, Chair Palmisano. Councilmember Cunningham already said everything I was going to say and more, other than just to note that this was something that Councilmember Warsami advocated for, and I felt compelled to sort of speak up for it, given the vacancy in that seat. I think it's important that we support work that we've been getting some positive feedback on, and this feels like an item where we probably just need to look for the money elsewhere in the budget on this one.
Sure. Councilmember Gordon?
Thank you. Yeah, I have concerns about most of this, and seeing that it's only $166,000, I'm wondering why we're spending so many millions on some other things that won't have direct impacts on the health and safety of our residents, like these things do. And some of them I was very intimately involved in. The temporary health inspectors has been something that's been recommended for years, and we keep pushing that off as a one-time funding. And so I think somehow it's become a really big target, even though what we really need is the ongoing health inspectors so that we can address lead poisoning in the homes of our city, and we can get way upstream on some of these problems that we're dealing with. I really appreciate comments made about the youth workers. I represent Cedar Riverside and Seward, as well as Ward 6, who will hopefully soon have a representative there for them. That was something that we worked hard on. We did it for 1 year. I had an opportunity to participate in an evaluation and talk with the outreach workers themselves and hear about how many people they helped get into opioid treatment and help and save and link up with jobs and partnerships with local businesses. So it's a critically important need. So I will admit I don't know as much about the fast track item without a little more explanation on here, but I'll be looking into that as well. And I'm happy to work with others on ways we can maybe get these savings somewhere else and recover these and get them back into the budget.
Sure. Thank you. Councilmember Jenkins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I just wanted to echo Councilmember Cunningham's comments, particularly around the fast track, and just name that is HIV AIDS related, which is still a significant health concern, a virus that has been impacting people for many years, like the coronavirus, which I believe we will be dealing with for many years to come as well. And also just, as you mentioned, Madam Chair, that, we had long discussions about these youth worker cuts in our initial budget conversations. I do think there was some concern around will these youth programs be functioning this summer, given the coronavirus. So I think there's some concern, and I'm not sure where that programming is. I do know that most summer activity has been either canceled and or postponed this summer for young people, which is really unfortunate, but very challenging in this environment that we're in. But if there's ways that we can restore this, I would be interested in supporting that as well.
Thank you. I want to direct colleagues a little bit to the chat. Our director did get some clarification from the mayor's office that there's grant funds being used for the fast track separate from these general fund monies. So it seems that this is not a cut to the program, but rather just a program reduction to the general fund that is being supplemented from somewhere else. And I wonder if there are others like that in this list as well. I know that our Commissioner of Health is ready to speak to these. I'll also share, I don't remember every part of our conversation about the part-time youth workers in Cedar Riverside and Seward, but it seemed to me, I do recall that program itself was making some fundamental different changes due to coronavirus, like the Council Vice President said. Director Musicant, could I call on you now to offer some clarification here?
Yes, thank you very much. Wanted to address a couple things. One is the comment by Vice President Jenkins around the impact of the coronavirus on the youth work. And we have been training our outreach staff in public health outreach principles. And so not only are the outreach workers continuing to work, but they're also, in addition to working with youth, helping to create more knowledge in the community, in the Cedar Riverside community, around safe practices for COVID. And we know that there's rising incidence within young people. And so I think that it's serving a dual purpose, and people are trained and prepared to help us in those two ways at once. In terms of the fast track, we did get some grant funding, but that was already anticipated as part of the proposal, I believe, that went in to the 2020 budget. And so we have, prior to knowing about this cut, we have been in conversations with clinics. Really what we're trying to do is create more model practices on HIV screening and services for clinics that serve communities that are underserved with testing and treatment for HIV. And we have agreements from clinics to move forward, but we have not executed those contracts yet. And so that's why it appears that the money is not expended, and it isn't committed yet, but work has been done with the clinics that could be brought to fruition quickly.
Thank you. Commissioner, do you know the fast track program, for example, that was supplemented through other types of grant funds? Is that the full amount, the full $50,000 to your knowledge?
Madam Chair, yes, that is the full allocation in the 2020 budget.
Right,
from the general fund.
No, so we're making that adjustment, but our understanding in our conversation prior was that some grant money was able to be used for that fast track program instead. And I'm curious, actually, Councilmember Cunningham is curious if the amount then being used from grant monies is $50,000 or if it's a different number.
Madam Chair, I will have to get you the fine detail, and I will do that. But I believe that our proposal into the 2020 budget already took into account that we were applying for the grant. And so this is a combination with the grant dollars to create the whole program. But I will provide more information about that. I see I'm getting text messages right now. We received $20,000 in grants. And so, yes, if there were at least 30,000 to make it whole into the 50, that would be helpful. So, according to my text messages I'm getting just now, the grant funding that was received was 20,000. So it does not replace the 50, but if we had somewhat less than the 50, we could still make good progress adding to that $20,000 grant, if that makes sense, ma'am.
It does. Thank you. Councilmember Cano, you're up next.
Thank you, Madam. I appreciate you leading this committee. I just wanted to say a couple of things. The $70,000 proposed cut to the Creative City Challenge is not something I can support. I think this is the time where we have to double down on our supports for artists of color and Indigenous artists and immigrant artists who are likely one of the biggest assets that we will need to mobilize and leverage to bring together and forward a vision and a solution for the issues we're seeing at 38th in Chicago, where the site of the memorial for Mr. George Floyd is, as well as leading a community process that's transparent and inclusive about what we're going to do with the 3rd precinct, that specific site and property, and perhaps other areas in North Minneapolis that were impacted as well. So I did reach out already to staff and to our council vice president to see if we can get some help on that conversation. I just wanted to address the Kajug issue a little bit because I didn't do this when the vote came up in the last cycle. I appreciate people's concerns for the community in the Cedar Riverside neighborhoods, and I've, as public safety chair, did get a chance to meet with many of the Somali mothers who were leading a lot of on-the-ground efforts to provide supports to the young Somali folks who are really struggling with some of the chemical dependency issues and gun violence. And when then Councilmember Warsame brought forward the allocation for Kajug, there was no RFP process that was put together for that. It was sort of a hand-picked group that he brought forward to the council for vote. I don't think anyone felt safe sort of pointing that out. And so I'm bringing it up now after talking to several people because they feel like ethically we can't allocate resources in that way where we just handpick our most significant political allies and fund them. In that specific case, then Councilmember Warsame had endorsed the executive director of Kajug to run for the 9th Ward Council seat, which of course at the time was my contender. And so I have a lot of just questions about the ethical and integrity nature of that specific allocation, and I fully support funding alternative and community-based systems of safety and mutual aid that help all of our communities, but I don't think we should do it by single-handedly picking out one group that has been specifically politically involved in our community and saying, you know, we're going to award this group this money with no set of outcomes and certainly no public process to compete for those dollars like we do with everything else that we do. So I'll just leave that on the table in terms of how folks are looking to address that conversation moving forward in the budget. And I do support Councilmember Cunningham's points of view on the fast track program, and I appreciate the mayor's aides responding here and providing information. I would want to know a little bit more about the children's savings accounts. And I don't know if staff are here now to talk about that, and I don't want to take a super long time because I can certainly get my answers offline. But I'm curious if the children's savings account work, is it a study? Kind of where is that work at? Are we paying a consultant? Are we actually paying young people to sort of do the groundwork? Just because I would like to better understand what those $43,000 would be paying for within the next 6 to 9 months. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to Councilmember Ellison, but ask kind of openly if Anna Groot is here from the Youth Coordinating Board because she's most heavily involved in it, or if there is someone else that might be able to step in to go back to Councilmember Cano's question. I think that'll just take a little while to figure out who's the best person to answer those, but it's important to get those answered ideally here in public today. So Councilmember Ellison, and then we'll go back to Councilmember Cano.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I really just want to reiterate a few things that a lot of my colleagues have already said. One is that this, I'm concerned about this overall cut because as we kind of go through and try to make these hard decisions, there's a lot of things that I've seen so far that have been hard to stomach. I think Councilmember Cano just mentioned one of them that pertains to the arts, but I understand that we have to make hard cuts. And so I've sort of just been slowly trying to accept some of the things and wrap my mind around some of them. But this particular cut to the fast track program and to the part-time youth workers in particular has me concerned, especially when I'm looking at the millions of dollars that we were putting in one of the previous slides to Target Center and the Convention Center. Can we not find $200,000 within that more to cut as opposed to cutting this amount here? I want to in the chat it's been mentioned that the grant money that was going to be in addition to this for the fast track program was going to be in addition to this 50,000. So I just wanted to make that clear. And then I also wanted to make just to say that even though youth workers are often not the youth themselves, youth workers are a lot of their effectiveness has everything to do with their credibility with youth. They're often young themselves. They're often underpaid as it is. And regardless of whether youth programming in certain areas is going to happen or not, youth are out, right? And so I just wanted to just name that because while I understand that the youth workers are not always youth themselves, often it is youth workers who are doing, and I don't mean to be hyperbolic, life-saving work when it comes to interfacing with youth, and they often come with the kind of credibility that you can't train for, and so I just wanted to highlight that and mention that I felt like I think Councilmember Cunningham phrased it as these are often small amounts of money that go really, really, really far, and so I just wanted to reiterate that point and encourage us to maybe cut a bigger chunk somewhere else to spare these small amounts of money that I think go into life-saving work and that are probably not enough money to begin with. So that's all. Thank you. If to just clarify, one of the concerns brought up when we spoke about these part-time youth workers in Cedar Riverside and Seward in the meetings about the budget, one of the specific concerns brought up by Council Vice President Jenkins was that this would reduce money going into the pockets of young people. And that was where my comment about that had come from was all. Councilmember Gordon, we understand you have some information because of your work with the Youth Coordinating Board. And did you want to share anything or any clarity on a couple of these line items?
Well, I'm happy to share my understanding. Those funds that are in the budget were to be used for research and were spent on hiring a consultant to work with St. Paul and also the state legislature and financial industries to kind of get set up the program. And I'm suspecting that the $43,750 have already been spent, and that's why that's the revised amount. So Councilmember Gordon, if I may ask you this next question, is it possible that we allocated $50,000 in last year's budget because that was an approximation, but that this money that has already been spent is how much it actually cost us here? Yeah, that's very possible. Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions or comments that people want to make about this page that I may have missed? I need to make a correction, I think, and of course, the Health Commissioner can correct me if I'm wrong. But I mentioned the health inspectors having to do with lead inspections, and now that I'm thinking about it and recalling the budget decisions, this is really for our food and lodging inspectors that we needed more of. So I'll just note that. And I'm assuming that that need is also still there, although the health commissioner could also weigh in. It's also possible that with the lack of operating restaurants, things have changed dramatically, and I'm just not aware of that.
Yeah. Director Musicant, did you want to weigh in on that?
Thank you, Councilmember Gordon and Chair Palmisano. Yes, the position is for the health inspectors, and yes, life has changed quite a bit with COVID-19, which caused us to not fill positions during the first part of this year, and so that's why we have not expended that amount. And with the hiring freeze, that was an additional complication. Restaurants now are opening, and they need more advice than ever, and we need to catch up on the inspections that were deferred during the first part of this year. So just to give you a status report.
Thank you. That's helpful. I'm not seeing other comments or people that want to speak right now about these. I appreciate the robust discussion here about this slide. For now, I'm going to ask Director Intramural if he would continue.
Absolutely, Chair Palmisano. In the Human Resources Department, the mayor recommends reducing the Human Capital Management System Replacement Project by $2.25 million. This general fund change item provides funding to replace the city's core IT system for human resources and payroll activities. HR, finance, and IT are working together to identify a broader solution and do not require these funds at this time. Chief Human Resources Officer Patience Ferguson, Chief Information Officer Fadi Fadil, Interim Chief Finance Officer Lori Johnson, and I are here to answer questions on this recommendation.
Thank you.
Seeing none, we'll go to the next slide.
Yep.
Great. In Neighborhood and Community Relations, the mayor recommends reducing the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs Partnership Agreement increase by $25,000. This general fund change item provides funding in addition to $75,000 of base funding available to contract for immigrant legal services. Director of Neighborhood and Community Relations, David Rubidor, and I are here to answer any questions on this recommendation.
I'm not seeing any.
All right, next slide, please. In the police department.
Wait, if I could, there is a question on that last slide or a comment from Councilmember Cunningham. Go ahead.
Sorry, that was a quick one, so I was trying to type real fast. So I just wanted to ask the logic for this particular cut. Again, like this is a cut to a particularly vulnerable population in our city, so I just was hoping to be able to get a better understanding of the logic of like why this particular area of NCR was what was decided for the cut to be done there. So
Chair Palmisano and Councilmember Cunningham, I think that in the general fund, so to an earlier comment I had made that there's a lot of activity that does not show up on these slides. Neighborhood and Community Relations is predominantly funded through a special revenue fund in the 2020 budget, which will be the last year that that's the case. And so this is one of a few change items in the general fund that was sort of part of the consideration. With respect to specifics about considerations related to the content of the item, I would defer to the mayor's office and can certainly facilitate some follow-up there offline or at a later time.
And Chair Palmisano, if I could weigh in a little bit on this as well, provide a little bit more context.
Sure, Director Rubidor, welcome.
All right, thank you, everybody. David Rubidor, Director of the Neighborhood and Community Relations Department, and Chair Palmisano and council members. Councilmember Cunningham, that's a great question. As Director Intermill stated, we have a limited amount of general fund in general in order to help offset the budget changes. The one thing I did want to really kind of emphasize here is that Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs received $75,000 ongoing to support immigrant and refugee work in the city. That is not affected by this, and so with this one-time increase, what we were looking at was to add another partner organization to help us in 2020 on a one-time basis. So I just wanted to let you know that we still would be able to continue the same service level as in 2019. This would just, I should say just, but this would hold off on doing any type of expansion at this time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, next slide, please. In the police department, the mayor recommends reducing the automated pond system and workforce director system replacement project by $50,000. This general fund change item provides funding to replace 2 proprietary IT systems operated by the police department and transitions those 2 systems, so both our pond tracking system and our scheduling system for the MPD, transitions both of those operations onto commercially supported platforms. I believe Chief Arredondo is with us, as well as our CIO, Fadi Fadil, to answer any questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions or comments from my colleagues? I'm not seeing any right now. There'll be another opportunity at the end if people do.
Sure. So moving to the next slide. In the Public Works Department, the mayor recommends adjustments to 2 items that come to a reduction in spending of $3,042,000. The first reduction is to the advanced mobility change item, specifically reducing funds available for mobility hubs by $42,000 in the general fund. The second reduction is to the parking ramp capital program. This would reduce spending by $3 million in the parking fund by postponing non-critical, non-life safety improvements in the city's parking ramps. Director of Public Works, Robin Hutchison, and I are here to answer any questions you may have on these 2 recommendations. Next slide, please. Last, but certainly not least, in regulatory services, the mayor recommends reducing the tenant navigator change item by $30,000. This general fund change item provides funding to purchase a vehicle for a new tenant navigator position, which has not been hired and will not be hired during the hiring freeze. Regulatory Services Director Kim Keller and I are here to answer questions on this recommendation.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any.
So then this concludes the second set of recommendations, which is scaling back on the city's programming in 2020. So the third,
if I could, sorry,
yep.
Councilmember Cunningham.
Again, I'm sorry, I keep talking. I'm surprised. I was trying to hold back to see if anybody else said anything. So I was just curious. So we have a very large amount of officers that are filing permanent disability due to PTSD now that is available for them to do. How will that, so we are going to continue paying officers that are no longer working. How will that impact our budget, not only this year, but moving forward?
Chair Palmisano and Councilmember Cunningham, those permanent disability claims are paid through our city's self-insurance fund, and we are monitoring that situation closely. Lori Johnson and our new Director of Risk Management, Emily Colby, are in extensive conversations about that, and I think that Ms. Johnson may be in a meeting right now about that topic. And so if there are any additional specific details, I may defer to Coordinator Ruff on this item.
Thank you. Mr. Ruff, did you want to say anything about it now, or we could wait until later? The point being that doesn't really have to do with this part of the presentation, but it is a general concern.
Yeah, it is a general concern. I don't have any more to add right now, Chair Palmisano.
All right, thank you. Council President Bender.
Yes, thank you. I was just getting in queue to chime in a little bit on this. I think my colleagues know, but for the public, the background is that this is a relatively new law that took effect in 2019 that is likely to result in more first responders filing for PTSD and becoming eligible for long-term disability, which would be a cost to the city in a sort of long-term fashion. And so that was a law that was passed that required local governments to bear that cost by the legislature. And so my last update on this was that the number of claims filed so far was relatively low, but there was concern or anticipation that they might be more coming. And just a general concern about the cost to local governments, including Minneapolis, for this. State law change that didn't include any financial support to cities who are bearing the cost of the requirement from the state.
Yeah, so without going in to great detail on this, I'll just say this is a known issue. It's been one that we've been working for 2 years since that law was passed to try and work to mitigate. In part, because of this last law, there was another one in 2013 that is challenging, but this is difficult for cities like ours. It's also absolutely devastating for smaller cities that end up with these kinds of workers' comp claims. So the League of Minnesota Cities is also quite involved in this work and in this effort, and we do lobby at the state legislature, knowing that we need to do something about it. So when we think about things to try and partner with legislators on, I don't know that when this was passed in 2018 that legislators really understood how this would get applied, and there's some precedent set through court cases about how it's getting applied. So this is a long-term concern. It's one that you've heard perhaps very recently in the media, but that's because of outside information that at this point is fairly more like rumors, where people have said 200 people from our police department are doing this, but in the last 30 days, we've only gotten in 17 claims for workers' comp. There's another avenue to this type of disability through para directly, and there is no obligation to tell the city when that process starts. So there might be more in that category, but we just don't know right now.
So if we can move to the next slide. So the third strategy included in the proposal is a reduction of $4.3 million across all funds in the city's payroll. I'll note that this $4.3 million of payroll savings does not reflect the full payroll savings in the across phases 1 and phase 2. Rather, it's in addition to many phase 1 items such as the hiring freeze, the wage freeze, as well as voluntary budgetary leave that has been solicited over the last several weeks. Voluntary budgetary leave that's been going on at the convention center since the spring, as their operations were swiftly and severely curtailed, as Executive Director Jeff Johnson mentioned earlier. This additional reduction will be achieved via a combination of mandatory furloughs, voluntary budgetary leave, and limited layoffs for city employees. Plans are still being developed about the specific particulars of reaching the $4.3 million targeted reduction. This is complex, as it is a negotiation that involves scores of parties, from union leadership and members to department heads and our elected officials. And it involves a number of variables, including minimum staffing levels, the impacts of our partial wage freeze, and individual funding for specific positions. Policy considerations include questions about what is the most appropriate distribution of shared sacrifice versus targeted reduction in force, as well as who participates in the shared sacrifice and to what extent. I've had extensive conversations with many of you and the mayor's office, and I know that everyone is interested in minimizing the impact of the city's financial strain on employees to the greatest extent possible. And that is why it's appropriate that this was the last lever pulled. I'll pause here and answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Director Intermill. I'm not seeing anyone in queue yet. I do just want to remind people of what you had said earlier, that to some extent in doing a revision to just this year's budget, layoffs, because of how we pay for their unemployment insurance, doesn't really get us much of a payroll reduction for this particular exercise. It is something we may need to consider in the future. And I'm still not seeing anyone in queue. So I would say, I think we talked about this prior. I will give the last word to Council President Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I similarly was noting that dynamic, although certainly with layoffs, the time at which the clock starts for those salary savings is a significant piece if we're looking at our budget over the next number of years. I do think that we need to take a strategic approach to staffing across our departments, and I'm encouraged by the commitments that I have heard directly from our department heads about maintaining diversity and guarding against the impacts of reductions on recent years' headway into diversifying our workforce. As Director Intermill said, a lot of these decisions rest upon negotiations with the bargaining units. I know we're all committed to equal treatment of all of our city employees. I mean, some employees receive paid overtime and others are just expected to work more hours for their same salary. And, I think we have a significant documented problem with gender and racial diversity in our workforce. And I think anecdotally, a lot of the folks who are carrying those extra hours unpaid are likely women and people of color in our workforce. And so I think making sure our values show up in these decisions about staffing are really important. And again, I'm encouraged by what I'm hearing from department heads about their shared commitment to those goals. I do think it's going to take a department by department approach to look at, again, I would say a 3 to 5 year time horizon at minimum to understand what different tools we have and when the cuts would result in potentially more costs versus cost savings. And so, for example, using early retirements as an incentive to support workers who've worked for our city for a long time, but also to maintain the diversity of our workforce with newer hires, is a strategy that in the short term may cost a bit more money, but in the long term may save us both in total costs as well as protect our core values and protect those employees who are newer to our city enterprise. I'm a bit concerned again at the sort of philosophical differences or approach to how we interact with our bargaining units, and again the underlying dynamics that some of our workforce is paid overtime and some is not. And so I'll just leave that as a comment. I am also a little concerned that, if those department by department conversations are happening, I'm not involved in them, and I don't know if council members are. So I think, again, having those strategic conversations with departments about the overall staffing approach feels really important. So I'll just leave that as those comments, and appreciate you bringing up it as well, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
So the next slide, please. So the final strategy used to close the gap is to deploy cash reserves. This is not a reduction in expenses. Rather, it's a strategic approach to balancing our budget while preserving our service levels to the greatest extent possible. The city maintains cash reserves for many reasons, and those include to provide shelter from a rainy day. And that day is here. The mayor is recommending using $57.5 million of cash across all funds, which represents roughly a third of the cash available associated with funds experiencing revenue losses. Specifically, the mayor is recommending the use of $8 million out of a total $40 million available in the general fund, $32.5 million of $57 million available in the downtown assets fund, $13.1 million of $13.8 million available in the parking fund, $3.2 million of $58.9 million available in the utilities funds, and $700,000 of $11 million available in other funds. When determining if and how to deploy cash to solve the problem, it's important to recognize first and foremost that each dollar can only be used once. As I said, it's raining today, but as the mayor reminded us yesterday, and certainly as the council president has iterated many times today, we don't know how long the flood will last. It's a delicate balance when determining how much to use today and how much to save for tomorrow, but finance staff is comfortable with the varying levels of cash deployment in the various funds I've just described. I believe the $156 million revenue loss estimate that we're solving for is reasonable, but admittedly, the assumptions behind it do lean conservative. And so that is to say any error to the positive. If things turn out a little bit better than we expect, that will shrink the use of cash listed on this slide and put the city in a better position to ride out the storm tomorrow. So I'll pause at this point to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Director. I think that was a really good analogy. You're good at those. Are there any questions for Mr. Intermill?
If not, next slide, please. Oh, excuse me.
Councilmember Fletcher, are you in queue for a comment at this point or for after?
I am. I wanted to ask about the cash spending a little bit.
Thanks.
Thank you. So I just wanted to kind of check, Director Intermill, I know that there are levels of cash that we need to maintain in order to maintain our bond ratings, et cetera. Are we sort of spending down to the minimum that we need before we start having that kind of an impact? Do we think that the spending that is proposed here might actually start having that kind of an impact and we might see our bond rating shift? So I guess I'm looking for a little bit of advice on that. And then, you know, I'll just name the conversation that we've had a little bit previously around the Downtown Assets Fund, and that we're spending that down pretty aggressively. And I just want to sort of think about, especially given that a lot of the revenue sources for the Downtown Assets Fund are likely to be among the slower to recover from the pandemic conditions. Sort of how are we thinking about the wisdom of spending that down?
Certainly, Madam Chair and Councilmember Fletcher, to the point about the minimum required fund balances contemplated in our financial policies and that the rating agencies may look to, the balances that I mentioned, for instance, the $40 million in the general fund, those are the available. When I speak to availability, that assumes that we want to continue to maintain the minimums. So we would still be maintaining our minimums as required by financial policies. With specific reference to the Downtown Assets Fund, yes, it is an aggressive use of cash. And as Executive Director Johnson mentioned earlier, the challenge that we have with the convention center, which operates out of the Downtown Assets Fund, is that we are obligated to host events for which we have contracted as soon as we're able to. And so because we don't know exactly when the governor will turn the dial on the events hosted indoors, we do need to maintain a ready position. And so that is what is contemplated in this approach. In terms of future years, we are looking at scenarios and doing our best thinking and our best planning for how we can continue to maintain operations in the fund and continue to deploy local taxes to support the general fund to the extent that they're able to under state statute, which then helps alleviate pressure on property taxes, getting back to some of the initial concerns that Councilmember Goodman mentioned, while all maintaining an eye towards both meeting our financial policies and the obligations there, as well as the debt obligations that we have taken out to finance the construction and improvements of these facilities. And so it is complex. This is an aggressive use of cash, but I don't think it's an inappropriate use of cash. And as I said, finance staff are comfortable with this recommendation, recognizing that there is still additional work to do into 2021 and beyond to get back to as we emerge out of a recession.
Thank you. Are there any other comments or questions from my colleagues on the use of cash part? Not seeing any. Go ahead.
Great. Next slide, please. So we have finally made it to the summary slide, and I hope that this helps to illustrate how the $98 million solution we've just walked through feathers out to the various funds to cover anticipated shortfalls. With the adoption of this recommendation, including any fully balanced amendments you as a council find necessary, the city will have solved for its pandemic-associated revenue shortfall. We'll then be able to turn our attention to addressing the additional expenses incurred due to the pandemic and to our 2021 budget, which, as we have discussed at length, will also present its own complexities. If there are no questions, we can go to the next slide.
I'm not seeing any. Go ahead.
Great. So finally, I wanted to share a visual calendar of the events of the next 2 weeks. This committee is scheduled to meet and hold a public hearing on the mayor's recommendations next Tuesday, July 14th at 6:05 p.m. You will then convene at 9:30 a.m. 1 week from today to mark up the mayor's recommendation in response to that hearing. A final public hearing will be held through this committee at 10 a.m. on Wednesday, July 22nd, and the City Council will meet as an adjourned body on Friday, July 24th to adopt Phase 2 of the 2020 revised budget. That concludes my prepared remarks. Happy to stand for any additional questions you may have.
Thank you. If we could leave this slide up, I think it's really helpful. Also, I would add for my colleagues that we ask that you would get any amendments that you're thinking about, even if they're not fully complete, but just to help us with this consolidated timeline and get any amendments or changes that you're looking to get in by Wednesday the 15th to our budget office so that we can try to make things go as smoothly as possible in this shortened time frame. I do see a number of people in queue, starting with Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have the City Council meeting on the 17th at 9:30, followed by a budget meeting at 1 o'clock. Is that incorrect on this calendar or on mine?
I believe it's wrong on this calendar, on this slide from the Budget Director. The Budget Committee markup is scheduled for 1 p.m. next Friday. Councilmember Goodman, you're correct. There's a 9:30 a.m. council meeting on that Friday. And at 1, we will have what might be a short break, but then we will start for markup at 1 p.m. that day. Let's see, Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you, Chair Palmisano. Is this an appropriate time for sort of broader comments?
Yeah, I think so. If I might, yes, I think now is a good time. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. So as we think about this budget calendar, really today kicks off the council's phase of this interim budget process. And I think as we think sort of big picture about what was just presented, I think we see a lot of very difficult problems solved. I think that there's a lot that needed a response in very unfavorable circumstances, and that we got. So I want to thank the mayor's office and the finance and budget staff for all of the work on this. I think as we reflect on sort of what is achieved here and what constituents may be asking for that's not yet achieved here, that I think represents sort of the work ahead. The conversation around transforming public safety that we've started and that we've moved a resolution on, and that we've begun to take action on as a council, is something that is not reflected as much in this version of the proposal at this time, as I hope that it will be by the time we get to adoption on the 24th. And so towards that, I want to offer a couple of staff directions. And I actually sent this around to department heads and to council as one single staff direction yesterday. We've made a couple of edits in response to feedback, both to clarify this and also to split it out. So I'm going to offer two staff directions. Maybe I'll discuss them both because I think they're really geared towards the same idea. And then I'll have two separate motions. But the idea really here is just to make sure that we frame up that we're getting the information that we need to be able to make decisions to start moving on this transformation. So one of the things that I think was very frustrating to many advocates who have been looking for us to start thinking about alternative ways of thinking about public safety is that I think the 911 work group feedback, for example, came too late in the budget process for us to actually enact some of the recommendations where it was suggesting that there were things that were enactable, that were sort of ready for implementation. And so I think we're to an opportunity where we want to make sure that the things that can be enacted are getting enacted. And I think we want to signal to the entire enterprise that we are on an action posture. And so what we're asking for is essentially what we're doing as leaders is asking for feedback from all of the departments to say, how can you participate in public safety strategies that help us in this process of transforming public safety. And we want to set a couple of deadlines for that feedback to come back so that we're able to actually consider that feedback as a part of our budget process. Now, I want to be really clear that we're not trying to create a crisis for department staff who are already working extremely hard on a number of extremely important things. But what we are doing is asking that the conversations that are already in progress, conversations you're having amongst yourselves, conversations you've already been having with the 911 work group, conversations you're already having with the mayor's office, conversations that you wish we were having but that we haven't found a context for, now is the time to bring them forward. And if you have something that is in an idea phase that needs to get to a more fully fleshed out concept, now's a great time to take that next step. If you've got something that's a fairly fully fleshed out concept and it's time to take it to a pilot, now's the time to start proposing that we move it to that next step. But what we know about the way city government works is that if we don't actually start taking steps, then every time we get to the next decision point, when we find ourselves back here in December, if we haven't moved anything forward, we're going to find ourselves having the same conversation in December that we could be having right now. And so I think it's important. I'm not asking anybody to go research and develop an entirely new approach by July 22nd. I want to make sure that's really clear. And I'm not asking anybody to duplicate efforts that are already in progress with the mayor's office or the coordinator's office or anywhere else in the city enterprise. But I am asking you to come forward with your best ideas, to come forward with the expertise of your department, to really think about the ways that we can meet the public safety needs of all of our residents, and to do that on two timelines, one geared towards this budget process that I expect will probably have some fairly minimal interventions, but hopefully will fund a few pilots and a few things that we can get off the ground and move to the next step. And then one that's really geared towards making sure that we have fully actionable information for the 2021 budget process so that we really can start to make some investments in a much more meaningful and long-term sustainable way in public safety efforts. The other direction, which I'm separating out, is to really put into action the things that the 911 work group has already said are actionable, right? We received the report yesterday that specifically said that report-only calls about theft are something that could be transitioned now, that's implementable. They feel like that's something we can act on. And that in general, report-only 911 calls and emotionally disturbed person calls that deserve a different kind of mental health response are something that they've identified as something that we could create an alternative response for and that we should be putting into action. The reason I'm separating these out is because they should come with a fiscal note, and so I'm going to make a different motion about them. But what I thought would be helpful would be to discuss them both together, and then I'll go ahead to start discussion and move staff direction 1 for approval.
Thank you. I have to say I certainly appreciate that it is important that even staff directions that come through this budget process, this short revised budget process, have fiscal notes, and Councilmember Fletcher has generously offered to make sure that that's done and taken care of before things come forward. And we need to expect that as a discipline that we all have on this committee. Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Maybe I just don't understand this, so I'm willing to accept I don't understand this, but essentially within 12 days, you want CPED to tell you how they're not going to do housing and they're going to do public safety instead? I mean, I'm confused. Is it every department in the city or just the ones that work on public safety, and how are they supposed to do anything in 12 days?
Thank you for the question, Chair Palmisano. If I
just go ahead and
Okay, that's great. So the idea, and I'm glad you asked that, because I think that might be the misconception that might cause people some anxiety if that's what they think. What I actually think is so CPED's a great example, right? CPED does interact with public safety in the course of their business licensing work, and there actually probably are some small ways that business licensing could think about, and probably has already been thinking about, participating in the overall public safety function in ways that, I mean, I've had discussions with them about a couple of versions of that, and we've been involved in a fairly extensive process around downtown nightlife and sort of thinking about how that works and what role business licensing plays. And so if they already have an idea and process, this is where I'm saying I want them to bring it forward. If they're saying if we had one more person, or if we had a little bit more resource over here to develop this idea, there's a piece of work that we could take on that we think we could actually do in a way that adds some value to the enterprise. I want them to bring it forward. Now, if they don't have that, if that's not something that exists, and I would guess that there are several departments that are scratching their heads saying, what are you talking about? I don't have anything like that. That's a totally okay answer for this 12 days. I'm not asking the assessor's office to invent a way that they participate in public safety. And I want to be clear about that. But I am asking for the ideas that have been discussed to get out of discussion and get in front of us so that we can start to think about how to act on them. And I think that there actually is probably more of that than people think. Certainly, we've been having a big public discussion that I know has generated a discussion among the whole enterprise, and that there are people who have ideas. And I think it's good leadership for us to ask, what are those ideas and what can we put into action? And if it doesn't generate a whole lot in 12 days, I'm not going to be terribly surprised or offended by that. And I'm not asking people to drop their core services work in order to do this. I think this is something that we're going to identify fairly quickly where there's work in progress that can be developed.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, that's a good, that's why I honestly asked. I did reach out to you yesterday too. It's my own fault for not getting on top of this, but I'm working on 100 other things like everyone else. If this is just asking people to come forward with their ideas, and many people have probably had conversations about their ideas, that makes sense to me. What I don't want it to do is put pressure on staff who are already really pressured and feeling the same trauma over everything now. It's just everything, and furloughs and budget reductions. I don't want them to feel like the council is saying to them, you have to come up with something or you're going to be punished or we're going to take away an FTE in order to do what we want. If it's really an open call for ideas within the enterprise, I support that. And I trust you. So I believe that that's what you're trying to do. I just don't want to put pressure on staff. When we have this issue at CPED, new leadership, and I'm just very worried about where our staff are coming from, especially when we're not all together, which is also another issue. So I'll take you at your word is that we're not going to punish those that don't come up with something. I don't want people to have to be thinking they have to come up with something because we're pressuring them to do so. But if there are good ideas, absolutely, let's hear them. Thank you very much for answering my question.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm glad you asked. I think it probably does clarify something that I had gotten another question about from staff as well.
Councilmember Bender and then Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I can be brief because I think a lot was just covered, but I love this idea of inviting more creativity from our staff. I think we should even set up like an anonymous tip line for staff to submit their creative ideas. Because I think you're right, Councilmember Fletcher, that so many folks in our city enterprise, so many staff are working on public safety every day and probably do very consciously see the connections between their work and keeping members of our community safe. So, and I'm thinking of so many examples just off of the top of my head. And then I also think there's a lot more connections that we can start to make across departments in this work. So for example, I know there are already connections between the youth violence intervention work and the housing staff who are working on housing people, but really deepening those connections and making sure that the right resources that our city already has in place are being deployed for those strategies. And we've talked about that for years, but I really love the idea of inviting our staff to step up with creativity. I'm sure that folks are already thinking about it, and I think hopefully this short exercise will inspire some longer term thinking and future invitations for staff to bring forward more ideas like this.
Thank you. Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate both of these staff directions and I support them. I just wanted to speak to item number 2, and I don't think what I'm about to say is in conflict at all with staff direction number 2, and I'm guessing the author would probably agree with me, but when it comes to transitioning these report calls over to 311, I do hope that that is a midterm solution and that in the long term, we're looking at responses that can be more effective at helping prevent crime and do crime prevention work as well. And I think that's part of our effort of having really a robust community dialogue about the best ways to respond and developing out plans in that way. So I do think it makes sense to transition those calls over as soon as possible to 311, but I do hope we can have more effective approaches in the future. And I don't see that in any way this staff direction number 2 as contradictory towards that. But I did want to call that out because I think that there's certainly more we can do to be more effective.
Thank you. Councilmember Fletcher, could you just help to share with us, both 911 and 311 reside within the city coordinator's office, and can you help just for the public to help people understand what this change would provide, or rather how involved 311 has been in these discussions about their ability to assume this amount of work. Because my understanding of 311, as is the public's from media, is just how overwhelmed that all of that department has been.
Yeah, and I think that's why we're asking for a progress report, and this was developed in coordination with the coordinator's office, specifically to make sure that we were looking at this in a way that was sort of thoughtful about the transitions in progress, because obviously 311 is undergoing a bit of a transition in expectations, both because they're all working from home right now and they're getting a different kind of questions, and there's actually kind of a lot going on in the 311 department in the response to the various crises we're experiencing. And also we have a vision around the public service center and a different kind of, as the new building opens, I think some new, more comprehensive response approaches. And so I think that there's a a real commitment to make sure that this is something that works, and it's obviously something that we will need to resource if it's a different kind of response, and we need to think about it in the best the best way that we can.
Thank you. Councilmember Ellison.
I don't have a ton to add. Just wanted to I just wanted to sort of voice my support for the staff directions. I think that for a number of reasons, one thing I want to say to Councilmember Goodman's point is I appreciate that we don't want to overburden staff, and I absolutely support that, and I'm glad that we were able to get some clarification from Councilmember Fletcher on that. But I also think that not just for the sake of staff, but for the sake of folks out in the public, there are things that we don't do very well with regards to safety. I think about the example that Councilmember Fletcher brought up in terms of sort of like thefts after the fact. And I hear from constituents that say, I don't actually know what happens with that report. I understand that I'm not going to get my stuff back, but what does happen? What's the follow-up? And if we can in any way sort of get that into the hands of a department that has an idea about what that should look like, I'm all ears and would love and invite that kind of feedback. And then secondly, with there's a lot of ways in which our departments work together. I think about how public safety has really kind of been relegated as a monopoly in a single department, and this maybe offers an opportunity for that component to be shared a little bit, even though it should, ultimately be the main responsibility of a single department. So that's all I wanted to say, and thank you guys.
Thank you. Coordinator Ruff, would you like to comment?
Sure, Madam Chair. Just one comment, which is this proposed staff direction has not been reviewed by 311. And so while there were conversations with parts of the coordinator staff, I can't guarantee that these timeframes can be met. And I did express that to Councilmember Fletcher yesterday after he released this document. So we always endeavor to try to provide better service to our residents and our businesses, and we will continue in the spirit of this kind of work. But I don't want to give the impression that this is an easily doable project, given all the other considerations that we discussed already today. Thanks.
Thank you. Councilmember Fletcher, did you want to respond to that a bit?
Sure. And I'll certainly say I recognize that this is going to be hard for anybody who's taking on a new line of work. And I do think it's the intention of this direction to signal that we are going to be asking the enterprise to do hard things. Our constituents are asking us to do hard things. And we've undertaken an extremely ambitious project of transforming public safety. And so we are, I think, in a place where something is possible but hard, something is challenging to think about on a timeline, we are going to be a little bit assertive about the need to get some things done. But that being said, the motion that I'll make, and maybe it's appropriate to move make both motions and call the roll on them together, but the motion that I'll make on the second staff direction is to refer it to the performance and innovation team in the coordinator's office so that they can develop a fiscal note around this. And I think that'll give us more of a sense of what kind of resourcing would need to happen in 311 in relationship to this implementation. So I guess I'll move both. I'll move staff direction 1 for approval and staff direction 2 for referral to the Office of Performance and Innovation in the coordinator's office.
Thank you. Councilmember Fletcher has moved both of these items. Is there any other discussion from my colleagues? I will add that in response to what the coordinator mentioned, I do hope that we can work in this spirit. A 12-day timeline is something that we need to be careful about, given the current ways that all of our staff are strapped here. I know that in conversation with Andrea Larson over the past few days, who has done a lot to lead this work, that she's comfortable with this and feels like we're ready to make this step. That's what encourages me to be supportive of this today. I also want to mention the ongoing and involved work of our mayor's office in this. We can't, as a city council, be doing things really separately here from the mayor's office as it pertains to really important work on reorganizing our city. I mean, this goes way beyond just traditional ways of doing business. This is fully about retooling so much of our city, and it's really important work. So I know that, and I've had conversations with Councilmember Fletcher and the mayor's office about how we work on this together and do this heavy lift together. So I am also supportive of this motion. Is there anybody else that wants to make comments? Seeing none, I believe, clerk, do we need to call the roll?
Councilmember Reich.
Aye.
Gordon.
Aye.
Cunningham.
Aye.
Ellison.
Aye.
Goodman.
Aye.
Jenkins.
Aye.
Kano. Bender.
Aye.
Schrader.
Aye.
Johnson.
Aye.
Fletcher.
Aye.
Chair Palmisano.
Aye.
There are 11 ayes.
Thank you. That staff direction is adopted. Councilmember Fletcher, did you have anything else you wanted to say or to talk about today before I call on Councilmember Bender?
That covers my comments. Thank you.
Okay, Council President Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to take one final comment about the sort of overall strategy of this proposal, and want to acknowledge that the mayor set up 3 meetings with myself, Council Vice President Jenkins, and Councilmember Palmisano to receive feedback. I asked a lot of the same questions in those meetings and talked about my concern over using cash and one-time cuts for ongoing expenses. It did result in a change to the proposal, which I appreciated. And I know that the mayor's office also sent out a lot of the detailed information to council offices and made themselves available to answer questions. And I know that we appreciate all of that accessibility and transparency as we're working together to make decisions on a quick timeline to really do the best for our residents in our budget. I do want to say that it's a little challenging for council members to create a completely alternative structured proposal. The mayor gave the direction to finance to avoid layoffs, as both he and the budget office have described. And of course, I think all of us share a desire to support our city's staff, and and certainly no one wants to lay off staff. But I just want to acknowledge that without an alternative proposal from the finance office or some way for us to dig in more on those staffing questions, it will be challenging for the city council within the time frame provided to create an entirely new strategy for these budget cuts. And so, I think we'll do our best to talk with, department staff, as I know many of us have been doing, about some of those short and long-term staffing questions. There are also many negotiations happening through the coordinator's office with our bargaining units, which limit in some ways our flexibility to make changes. So I remain concerned about the structural questions of this approach to budgeting, particularly as it pertains to the levies, not just next year, but particularly the year after, which will come after the next election. So this is the last couple of budget decisions that come before the next election, and then there will be a next election. I certainly don't want to punt, large levy increases or deep cuts to that final budget, year of this term, just in a spirit of transparency for our constituents and the public. So I know I will, and I'm sure others will continue to ask questions about the 5-year financial projection. I know we'll see a budget proposal in August, but that will be after we've made these decisions. So thanks for, again, all of you for digging into these details, both on this sort of structural approach to our budget as well as these specific details.
Thank you. Seeing no one else in queue, if there's no objection, I will direct the clerk to please receive and file this report, which is the analysis of our budget committee. With that, we've completed this business before us, but before adjournment, I need to just make sure we review the remaining timeline in which we'll work to complete this revision. It's just especially important for the community that's watching. First, I want to echo Council President Bender's comments that we're working at a very rapid pace in order to minimize the address of this continued loss of revenue, which day by day creates a bigger gap for us to fill. Community needs are at an all-time high. In terms of next steps and participation, I want to remind the public that this committee has 2 scheduled public hearings on this, and the first is set for next Tuesday, July 14th. Beginning at 6:05 p.m. As with all our meetings, these public hearings are going to be conducted virtually using our online platform like this meeting. Information on how to participate is available on our website, or for those who need other information or need assistance, please contact the clerk's office during regular business hours, Monday through Friday, 8 to 4:30 p.m. Their number is 612-673-2216. The Budget Committee will conduct a markup session with initial amendments from council members on Friday, July 17th, beginning at 1 p.m. as this corrected slide shows. Thank you. We expect to bring forward a final budget proposal to the full City Council as part of our adjourned meeting scheduled for Friday, July 24th at 9:30 a.m. This entire calendar is also published on our city's website. With that, we've concluded all business to come before the committee today, and without objection, we stand adjourned. Thank you for your time.